Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Leon. It's great to be with you, and thanks for joining my talk today. I am an associate professor in the psychology department at Loyola University, Chicago. I've been a member of the TCOM community for a number of years now, and it's great to share with you some of my recent research here on the barriers that family members experience, the personal barriers that might be getting in the way of their ability to be a support to children in foster care. And this is an article that just came out about a month ago with some of my grad students. You see here the title, Barriers to the Involvement of Extended Family and Fictive Kin in the Lives of Children in Foster Care. Of course, I'll be getting into all this. And what I want to start off with first, because family is so important, is just a reminder of the history here. And that is when nationalized foster care back in the 60s really came on board, the extended family of kids in foster care were really not engaged. They really were not seen as important. Kids' existing social networks were not thought to be important because it was thought that, and some of this was very unfortunate discrimination taking place, but it was thought that if a parent was unable to be a parent for their children because of any challenges or barriers they were having, whether it was addiction or criminal involvement, that surely the extended family must also have some of the same problems. So they were not engaged as placements, for example, as kinship placements, and they certainly were not engaged for any other sources of social support. And generations lost that opportunity to have family be an important part of their growing up because of that. But that changed. And one of the things that changed were these models that you see here. Back in the late 80s, certainly throughout the 90s, we see family service models jumping onto the scene that don't only recognize family as important, but recognizing family as central to treatment planning, central to the child welfare service plan. We want them not just in the car, but driving the car. That was a radical shift. Now, of course, what's happened? As we start to reflect on this family-centered movement, unfortunately, it hasn't lived up to the dream in many ways. And what I show you here is this was an article written about 12 years ago. And what they did is they took a look at family group decision-making studies. And they wanted to ask the question, who's showing up to these family group decision-making meetings? The heart of family group decision-making, this program, is getting family members to the table to really look at the child's strengths, to look at the family's needs, and to step up as a group to support the kid and to support their parents so that we can see them reunited. Unfortunately, they found that very few family members are going to meetings. Here's a study looking at just example kids and the families members showing up. Here's a child here who had a grandparent and one family member representative. And usually when we see these grandparents or aunts coming to these meetings, those are the kinship placements. So it's really the foster parent who's showing up to these family group decision-making meetings, but we're not seeing the neighbor and the coach and the pastor and the therapist and all of these important people. We're not seeing this multi-generational representation of family all coming to the table. That was the dream. Maybe it was a bit too idealistic to think that could happen, but it certainly was the vision. And the current practice is not living up to that vision. I think that's something that anyone being honest about the current child welfare system would have to say. So when we turn our attention to some of the reasons for that, one of the things we realize is that we really don't know much about these family members. We created this family-centered model without knowing who these family members were. Among children in foster care, what do we know about extended family? And we should certainly want to know about them if we're going to go about engaging them. So that's what I set about to do here in this study. What I would say, just looking at the second point here, is that when barriers to involvement have been examined, it hasn't been at the individual family member level, what's going on in their lives that might be serving as a barrier to their involvement with kids in care, but rather what are some of the dynamic factors that might be going on. For example, family conflict. If you see a lot of estrangement and family conflict, which you do see in families with children in foster care, you do see estrangement, you do see conflict. Some of that has been seen as a real barrier to getting people to the table to show up at these family group decision makings. And of course, that makes sense, but that would be a challenge. But what we haven't seen is any research looking at the actual individual family member themselves and what might be going on in their lives that is seen as a potential problem, a challenge to engaging them, to involve with kids. So that's one of the things we wanted to look at. So one of the things I did is, as part of a larger study examining family finding, we looked at any family member we could get in touch with, any family member we could find out about, and we found out about all the supportive things that family members were doing, all the good things, all the social support, whether it's tutoring, mentoring, transportation, any kind of emotional support to the child. We did that for any family member we could get in touch with. But we also took a look at the various barriers that any family member might have to being involved. And some of that we got about through word of mouth. Some of it we got about through background searches and things like that. But we did our best to try to get a sense of some of the challenges that might be going on in the lives of family members among kids in care. And when we did that, we found that there were and are a number of barriers, and you see them here, a number of challenges that family members experience that we might speculate could be a hindrance to supporting the kids. And some of these vary in severity, of course. But for example, we see a number of family members who live out of state. Doesn't mean they can't be part of phone calls and Zoom calls and letters and things like that. But in terms of day-to-day support, that certainly stands as a potential barrier to involvement. Prior criminal involvement of a family member could certainly, and of course, depending on the criminal involvement, the type, child welfare history, meaning having their own children in custody as a barrier, being involved in perpetrating domestic violence, having substance abuse concerns, being incarcerated. Certainly some family members, we simply don't know where they are, having medical concerns, or experiencing mental illness. These were the barriers that we discovered when interviewing these family members and asking about other family members and trying to get a full picture there. And so what you see here is you see the barrier type, out of state, and then here are the number of family members in the family that have it. 26% of all kids have no family members with any issues at all on the barrier, okay? So what this means is that 74% of kids have at least one family member who lives out of state. What we see also is 54% of the kids don't have any family members besides their own parent with a child welfare history. So here you get a real nice sense of some of the barriers to involvement that we see among family members in kids' lives. So we were able to, just going through these again here, substance abuse, 60% of kids don't have any non-parental family members who are experiencing substance abuse challenges, but 40% are. So about a third almost have one family member who has a substance abuse concern. So then what we were able to do is take a look at, we did what's called a latent profile analysis. And what we were able to do is try to see, are there groups of kids? Are there clusters of profiles of kids that vary in terms of the types of barriers their family members experience? This is a common clustering, or what's known as a person-centered approach to look at typologies of families. And what we found, and you see this very often showing up in the literature, we found two family types. We found families where the children where the families of these kids didn't have a lot of barriers. And we looked at some of the more prevalent and concerning barriers domestic violence, prior DCFS involvement, criminal history, and substance abuse. And so we see two types of families. In red here is the lower barrier family type, where you see an average of 0.5 relatives with domestic violence concerns, and an average of one family member in these families that have a family member with a criminal history. And so we term this the low barrier family type. These kids, most of them, have one family member in their social network who has a concern. But all in all, we do not see widespread concerns. We don't see widespread barriers in the families, which means that most of the family members in these low barrier families don't have any of the concerns, the major concerns that we found. Then we have a high barrier profile group. Here, what we're seeing is not only do kids have families where we see these barriers, but we see them where there's lots of barriers, right? Kids in this family typology have 2.5 family members who are involved in domestic violence. So they're seeing, depending on their exposure to these families, a lot of domestic violence, a lot of criminal history, substance abuse, and DCFS contact. Again, in those families, we would speculate that the presence of barriers is more widespread. The good news is that it's a very low number. Only 12.7% of all the families that we studied were these high barrier groups. The overwhelming majority were kids who were in families where there were barriers, but they were not widespread across the whole family system. And then what we did is we looked at these higher barrier and lower barrier groups, and we studied for any differences. We didn't see any demographic differences between the groups, any differences based on age, race, ethnicity, gender, placement. But where we did see differences was we saw two strengths in particular, psychosocial strengths, and this is based on a prior factor analysis that grouped, based on looking at intercorrelations, grouped various CAN's strengths variables like optimism and coping, for example, into an overall scale. And we found two CAN strengths needs variables to differentiate the higher and lower barrier group, psychosocial and community involvement. Children who are in these higher barrier groups, these higher barrier families, had fewer strengths in the psychosocial area and in the community involvement area. They had less in terms of coping strengths, less well-being. They had less involvement in their community. They came from communities that had fewer opportunities from community involvement. So we really did see some CAN's differences. And it makes us wonder whether or not being in a family who has a lot of family members with barriers means that maybe there are fewer role models for these children or fewer opportunities for family members to connect them to their community. And that's one hypothesis about why these kids in the higher barrier group are having fewer strengths. Notably, there was no difference in the two groups on internalizing problems or externalizing behavior. So the conclusion here is that, first of all, it's very common for any child in the child welfare system to have an extended family member with a barrier, to have an extended family member with substance abuse or who engages in or perpetrates domestic violence. It is common. However, what isn't common is for children to be in families where there's a large percentage of family members who have that challenge. And I think the reason that's important is because I think it's important for caseworkers to understand this. When we teach people about base rates, we see that it can really influence behavior. If we can talk to caseworkers and tell them that when they do family-centered work, yes, they may find a family member that has a barrier, but they should expect that most family members won't. And we know memory is what it is. And we know that what memory does is it makes us think of the negative cases. And those take on an outsized influence in our mind. When in reality, what we should be doing maybe is recognizing that, yeah, I'm going to work with extended families where there are some folks who are having challenges, but most of the family members, and I hope that what that can do is that knowledge can hopefully, get caseworkers to redouble their efforts and really, maybe in some cases, really rethink how they engage family. I thank you very much and hope to see you again soon.